What was it like in the immediate aftermath of December the 7th, 41?
Well, there was a great deal of anger about this because we tried to keep a neutral agenda, but it didn't work because first the Germans were sinking our troop ships and things like that. Then, of course, Pearl Harbor, that sealed the issue. We had to get into war at that time. At the beginning, I'd have to say that the Japanese were winning the war because we did not have the strength of the troops, and our Navy had taken a big loss at Pearl Harbor. So while we were rebuilding the Navy, losses at places like Wake Island, that was just tough because there were just a few Marines on base, and you just can't hold off a division or so with a couple of Marines with rifles. We were stationed at Parris Island, and Parris Island is one of the hottest places in the world, and I don't know how that happens. You know, it was unbearably hot. And the first thing they did is stand us at attention for an hour. At the end of the hour, 6 people had collapsed from the heat, and they were gone the next day. They were no longer at Parris Island. It was rough. Well, there was an interval at Camp Lejeune, and I took a course in BAR, and that's Browning Automatic Rifle, and I became an expert rifleman. From that point on, I couldn't get rid of the rifle.
Well, in April of 45, the United States had decided at that time, in order for the preparation of the invasion of Japan, that they were going to occupy Okinawa. You were part of the invading force. What
Right.
was those initial days and months like?
Like Peleliu, it was supposed to be a bloodbath, and we were supposed to cut the island in half, take over the Kadena and Yantan airfields, and by the time we got to the other side of the island, we were supposed to be just about all shot. But it turned out the pre-invasion bombardment lifted, and the first casualty actually was fatality from an amphibious supply truck where the driver turned over in an irrigation ditch. People were looking at each other saying, "Are you sure we're on the right island?" Because, you know, this isn't like the Japanese. They like to greet us with a lot of rifle fire and mortars and whatnot, and so this was just atypical.
Tell us about, I think there was a fellow named Slugsley Fluman.
Yes, Slugsy Fluman was a Brooklyn boy, and it was one of those times. I had just gotten out of the hospital the first time, and by the time I picked up my equipment and I got a ride in the Jeep most of the way, and there was a couple of miles that I had a hike to get back to my platoon, or where I thought my platoon was going to be. When we got to about a mile from where I left the Jeep, I came under machine gun fire, and I dived into an irrigation ditch, and was surprised to find that there were 4 people there. 2 were replacements that were not there when I went into the hospital, and then there was Slugsy Fluman, who had I guess it was machine gun fire, that broke his femur and upper leg. They were concerned with how they were going to get him out because every time they stuck a finger up or something, they got machine gun fire. I said, well, wait a minute, I got a white phosphorus grenade, I can lay down a smoke screen. They thought that was a good idea, so I pulled the pin, and I was ready to throw it when Binkley was trying to shove the stretcher under Slugsy, and he kicked the hand, and the grenade goes up and down into the water, and I feeling around for it, which is dumb because it would have blown my hand off. it went off. We got a smoke screen, wasn't as good as I'd hoped for, but it sprayed us with all these little specks of phosphorus. We were able to get out under the smoke screen, and we went back towards where the platoon had pulled back. And so as we were going back over the field, it was a couple of miles, carrying the stretcher, we dried out, and the little particles of phosphorus started to glow in the dark. We got Slugsy off to the hospital, and Sergeant Bird, the platoon sergeant, came up to me after Slugsy had gone off to the hospital and said, "You know, Snyder," and I got to clean this up a little bit, he said, "You know, when you guys were coming across the field, you looked like a frickin' fleet of fireflies."
You were a dual recipient of the Purple Heart with
Right.
Gold Star. Tell us a little bit about those two experiences.
I was getting ready to assault a village. It had been raining for about 10 days, I would think. My rifle, I had kept my BAR under my poncho to protect it from the rain, but in the morning I checked it out and it had rusted some parts on the interior. I pulled the trigger and it shot one round, ejected the empty shell. Then I had to push the bolt forward again to put another round in the chamber. That went on for several rounds, and finally it got to kicking over, and it was firing automatic. And about that time, there were two other guys with me, and I heard this whistling sound, and it was artillery, and I knew what it was, but the old saying is you never hear the one that hits you. Well, that's not entirely true. So it hit 6 or 7 feet from where we were sitting. The two guys were in bad shape, so I got up out of the trench where we were and started running across a field, and it was all wet grass, and it just sounded like I was running through a crinkled up cellophane or something. It was very crisp, and I went about 15 feet and I collapsed. The next thing I know, I'm on a stretcher being loaded onto a Jeep. Well, it was wet and all the wheels just spun around. They didn't go anywhere. Finally, they transferred me to a 10-by truck. That's a 10-wheel truck with 10-wheel drive. And it didn't go anywhere either. So they put me on a Weasel, which is an amphibious vehicle about the size of a Jeep. And that took me to the bay where I was transferred to an Alligator, which is another amphibious vehicle, except it's larger for landing troops. And so they took me to the hospital. I spent about 10 days in the hospital before I could get back to duty. The second time I was running through a minefield, and some sniper was trying to get me, and I was zigzagging, and at any rate, something went off in the back of me. I don't know if he hit a mine or whether it was artillery, but the next thing I woke up kind of hazy, and I was up to my chin in water, and I guess it was a shell hole or a pond, whatever, and two guys were pulling me out. And so they loaded me into an Alligator again, and about that time I passed out. I woke up the next morning. I was kind of hazy about this, but I heard some people talking, and it was Graves registration. Well, they had left me outside on a stretcher with my poncho over me. I was able to reach out and grab a shoestring, and the guy says, "Holy shit, I think this one's alive." And then I woke up the next day, and they said that they had taken out 28 ordnance fragments from either whatever it was that blew up. And so I was in the hospital for another 10 days or so. On the 2nd of July, Sergeant Byrd came up to me and said, Snyder, he says, take your gear over to headquarters company. And I said, why am I doing that? And he says, because you're going home. We got a directive that said all people with multiple Purple Hearts are to be shipped home. So that wasn't the worst news I ever heard. So I reported to headquarters company, and since it was near the 4th of July, I thought, I'll take this very pistol that was there with a couple of flares and shoot him up on the 4th of July. So 4th of July, we were in the chow hall talking to a couple of guys. And as we left, the guy at the door said, hey, he says, a couple of Japanese has been reported a swimmer in the Asa River. So at any rate, we were walking down the path by the Asa River, and this buck-naked Japanese pops up in front of us, and he's running down the path, and I pulled out the very pistol and let him have one in the back. Well, he was picked up by a couple of guys down the road, and they took him prisoner. And so on the 8th of July, we were loaded onto the Winged Arrow. There were 50 of us Marines with multiple Purple Hearts. And I found out at that time that there were also a little over 1,000 prisoners on the board ship. And they came up every day for 3 reasons. 1, for exercise, 2, to wash their clothes, and 3, to get medical attention. And I was on guard duty with a .45 pistol on my hip and watching the people get medical attention. This one came up and took off his shirt, and there he had this burned back. And I says, aha, I know that guy. The thing is, we were coming home and the war was still going on when the Japanese hadn't surrendered or anything. I was doing guard duty on some of these prisoners. Well, when we got near the Mariana Islands, that was a big air base, and it had a lot of B-29s, and closer we got to this hum of airplanes was in the air, and these Japanese just, stopped and kind of looked up, and the one I was standing next to, his jaw dropped about 6 inches because they'd been told the Imperial Japanese Air Force had shot down all the American planes. And when we finally got to Hawaii, we downloaded the prisoners, and we got another load of Americans. I had to wait quite a while to get discharged because my health record had gone on to Tientsin, China with the division. And by the time I got it back, it was 6 months later when I finally did get out. I got my medal the day before I was discharged. I think it was the 16th of April. Certainly, I'm a rarity as far as the people surviving from the war because most of them were older than I was.